All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar today hosted by the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy's Innovation Policy Lab. I'm Claire Porter Robbins. I'm a journalist and an aid worker, and I'm also a Munk School alumni. Today, we're going to be talking about Pope Francis and the future of work. And so those are big issues, and we only have an hour today, so we're going to get right into it. We are inviting questions from the audience, so please write to us in the Zoom's Q&A field, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those questions today as we can. I will introduce our panelists today. We have first Paolo Foglizzi. He's a member of the editorial board of Agio Ornamenti Sociali based in Milan. Excuse my terrible Italian pronunciation. Then we have Father Cleet Kelly, who is a senior advisor of Unite Here International Union and the chaplain with the Chicago Federation of Labor. We also have Joe McCartan in Washington. He's the executive director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown University. And we have Sarah Prenger in Brussels. She's the international president of the Young Christian Workers in Brussels. And finally, we have the man who convened this all today, Peter Warrion. He's the distinguished fellow with the Innovation Policy Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And he's going to briefly lay out why he's gathered everyone here today and what we'll be discussing.
Well, thank you, Claire, and thanks for everybody who's signed on. We wanted to have this conversation because a number of things that Pope Francis has said about COVID, its health, but also its social effects, the future of work and the environment have gotten a lot of attention. And one of the unique things we want to suggest and we'll be talking about is his perspective on work as something that ties all of those together, and particularly in an ethical perspective. Now, this is the Pope, but he's not just trying to talk to Catholics or believers. He's trying to talk to non-believers and the whole global community, but really to see how those three elements of technology and work, health, COVID, and the environment can be linked together with a particular focus on work and an ethical perspective on work. So that's what we're hoping to accomplish. And again, we're trying to reach out and convey that conversation to a broad audience. So thank you, Claire.
Right. Well, yeah, thank you so much for organizing us all today, Professor. I think the first thing that I want to start off with is sort of the perspective coming from unions, because they're such a large part of how we have historically mobilized for labor rights. And I was wondering if we could ask Father Kiley about his perspective on that from where he stands in Chicago.
I think we're facing so many challenges right now. As you indicated in the introductions, I work with Unite Here, which is hotel workers, restaurant workers, basically hospitality workers, including gaming workers, in both Canada and the US. And early last year, we hit the reality that about 90% of our members were out of work. And here in Chicago, that collided with, at the same time, a good deal of social agitation that was going on around Black Lives Matter and also around immigration issues. And overwhelmingly, the membership of Unite Here are people of color, women, and immigrants. And so the whole situation has really forced not only Unite Here as a union, but many other unions to have to look and take on a whole different way of interacting. The idea of care is work and work is care, which has been referred to was something that probably was an idea in a local labor union. But in fact, the situation has forced us to adapt, so that you find many local unions now doing work like social services, rather than just handling grievances or contract negotiations. We've had to create charities, connect members to other social services, to healthcare. You know, in the U.S., one's healthcare is tied to work hours, and so that's been a significant challenge. And so I would say it's been overall a very challenging time. I'll talk about technology maybe in another segment here, but the union has had to adapt in so many ways. I would say that one last thing here, that the new union hall is a Zoom call. That maybe captures it all. We can't meet in person, and you know, for labor folks, everything's in person. And so you can imagine the culture shift this has demanded that we undertake, and to get our membership used to texting and receiving text messages, and it's a whole new world in many ways. And that's probably enough to kick us off there.
Right. So our next question is to everyone, but I imagine Sarah will have some thoughts particularly. I'm wondering what the new realities are for the next generation, the younger generation of workers. How are young people experiencing and confronting these issues of new technology shifts in relation to also the pandemic requiring sort of rapid evolving on their sort of skills?
Yeah, since we don't have so much time, maybe already in the beginning to say that everyone who's interested to get a little more information, we conducted a survey about the impact of the pandemic on young workers' reality all over the globe. And you can find this on our homepage. I will also send the link afterwards to the organizers so you can spread it. But as a summary, I would say that actually young workers feel that the pandemic created like an interruption of all our work and life. But in reality, it's not really an interruption. It's more like enhancing processes which have been going on before, especially regarding inequalities and the technical development. As Father Kleed already also said, that all these inequalities which have been there before regarding gender, regarding age discrimination, and also the inequalities between migrants and those who are natives, they have been increased before, and also the huge differences between informal workers and those who have a stable work relationship. And it's the same between precarious workers and stable workers, you might say. And of course, as we all see, you know, and as we also heard, that now the Zoom hall is the trade union hall. All the processes of the technical development which have been there before are just enhanced and boosted. And this is on the one hand really having positive impacts, because it's also great for young people to be always reachable, to always have the possibility to talk to people who are maybe in another country. But when we look more deeper, we see that actually precarization is boosted through the technical development. And on the one hand, this aspect of always being reachable, it even impacts education, because there's teachers who are just contacting the young people. Maybe you can still do another homework and you can give it in tomorrow. And this is new. No, before, homeworks has been given in the morning at school, but not like all of the day. And this makes it really impossible for young people to plan. And that is the same effect which is happening at work. So things which have been going on at work before now are happening all over the day, even at 5 o'clock in the morning. And it's also the same regarding platform workers and people who are working from home, because there are so many issues about workers' rights, which really have to be discussed again, now having this new technical situation. So these topics have been there before, as I said, but now they're much bigger, because everything which is connected to technology is somehow the aspect which is actually there. And there are so many other jobs which have been destroyed, as Fazaklit also said. And as we know that young people are usually the first losing their jobs.
Mhm. Thank you, Sarah. I think that's a good segue to move over to Joe and discuss the implications for the economy and labor policy, and perhaps how that relates to younger workers.
Well, thank you, Claire, and thanks to Peter for putting together this important discussion. So, picking up from what Sarah said, I think that what we're seeing currently in the United States, at least, and I think that this is true in Canada and over much of the world right now, is that the COVID-19 outbreak has acted to exacerbate trends that were developing for decades in our economies. In many ways, it's been an amplifier of inequalities that were already present and developing. Sarah spoke to some of the ways it's acted in this way. I think it's exaggerated for one part, the inequalities between the formal sector and the informal sector, between authorized immigrants and unauthorized immigrants. And certainly that's been a problem in the United States, between workers who work manually and have to leave their home to work, to workers who, like us here, are able to sit in their homes and conduct our work from day to day. It's also exacerbated divisions or differences, I would say, in the experience of men and women. It's affected women, I think, far more than men in some ways, and caused them to withdraw in some ways from the labor force. And I think it's also amplified differences across racial lines as well. So the pandemic has come at a moment in the development of our economies over the past several decades in which I think neoliberal trends had weakened all things common, and government's ability to really protect a couple of essential things: workers' voice, their ability to really impact the terms and conditions under which they work, their security, social security, and their safety, and their workplace safety. And in the United States, on that last matter, we really saw some terrible things occur during the pandemic, as I'm sure many listeners to this webinar saw in the news, things like packing house workers who were so afflicted by the disease that in some places, there was a notorious case in the United States where supervisors had a pool about how many workers would be taken down by COVID in their operation. I think all of this highlighted a problem at the center of our economy in the United States. I think it's true in Canada and much of the world as well. And that is, over recent decades, we've really seen those institutions that were developed in the post-war era to provide worker voice and worker security have been so weakened to place workers in situations of great vulnerability. And so what I think this moment calls us to, and what I think is so important about what Pope Francis is doing, is to recognize that we need to be focused on the future of work, but also to put at the center of that the future of workers. And it's really the future of workers that requires a great focus at this moment. We need to rebuild these mechanisms that we constructed in the post-World War II era to try to protect workers. I think we've seen just how frayed our systems are now. And so that's my biggest takeaway, I think.
Right. Peter, Joe was just speaking about that sort of fraying of these institutions and how the pandemic has really illuminated how workplace safety and workplace rights have really been sort of decaying throughout the years from neoliberal sort of institutions prior. Do you see them getting sort of worse before they get better? Or do you see, based on your innovation research, do you see this as sort of a turning point?
Well, I think it is a kind of turning point. I think, frankly, I think the Thatcher Reagan years are over. We're trying to figure out the new direction we're in. I think it's also important to say, and this is part of the church's perspective, when Francis tries to link these issues of environment, technology, and we begin with issues that are very technical, and maybe technology and economics, but ultimately ethical issues. What do I mean by that? I mean, prior to the pandemic, the last few years, we had broad-ranging fears that robots are going to eliminate all the jobs. And that a lot of research now, that's not true. I mean, there'll be jobs lost, there'll be jobs gained, but for the most part, there'll be changes in the task or the compositions of jobs. And what that means is that retraining will probably be a bigger issue than mass unemployment. But what are people's rights to retrain? And then, of course, what are they retraining for? The further aspect is that studies on high-tech workplaces. What do employers who have embedded the new, what do they really want from and need from their workers? They want workers who are engaged, trusting, communicative, want to learn, want to share. Those are ultimately ethical questions, rather than just technology or economics questions. They're ethical questions. And the question there is going to be, if that's what's being asked of workers, what are employers able or willing to make as an ethical commitment to workers in the past? So as I said, you start with this very broad thing and you get down to ethical issues. And finally, for the church, work is inherently valuable, human labor. It's a source of dignity, developing human capacities and building the common good. And the common good is where Francis links the environment and the social purposes of the economy together. And that's where we start with things that seem technical, but we wound up with basically social choices. And that's why, as Joe was just mentioning, strengthening rights of workers and migrants' rights around the world, strengthening international governance, because the environment's an international problem. You can't isolate it in one country. And that these things ultimately have a moral purpose, or they don't have any purpose. That's how I think he links them together.
Right. With that moral purpose, I think we should turn to Paolo. Let's talk about the notion of the work in Laudato Si and those dimensions of how the environment and the economy can come together to expand the notion of decent work.
Thank you, Claire. I think it's a really important point. If we want to think of the future of work, we have to start elaborating on the notion of work that we have in mind. I think that most people would say that work is what you trade with your employer in exchange for your wage. But this is really not enough. Laudato Si is providing a different insight. According to Laudato Si, work is any activity involving a transformation of existing reality. And this is very interesting because work is much broader than the labor market. There's a lot of work going on in the informal sector, as already mentioned. There's a lot of work going on within families, in the household economy, and so also the situation is very different from among developed countries and developing countries, where, for example, household economies are more and more important than in our countries in the northern or the western hemisphere. So in that sense, if we have a different and broader notion of work, we are led to discover that work is basically a relationship. And this is where the ethical reflection are relevant. It is a relationship among those who work and the environment and the reality they transform. So that's where ecology is important. And it's also a relationship with those with whom we work and those for whom we work, both the employers, but also the final beneficiaries who use the product of our work. So if it is a relationship, it needs care. There is no relationship who can survive without care, as we all know from our family experience. If there is no care, the family is broken. So that's where care is work and work is care. There is a care dimension of work, and a really decent work is a work that allows people to take care of their reality. This is both in the sense that, for example, you have to respect people's right at work so that they can still live their decent life, and so be in good relationship with their colleagues and their families, but also in the sense that if, for example, you're asking somebody to work to produce abuse of the environment, that's not respecting his dignity as a human being. And so you cannot consider that decent work. So the inspiration of Laudato Si, in a certain sense, is giving a different pattern, a different horizon within which to think the future of work. And I think the pandemic has proved that this is very important. We've seen how deep are the relationship between the environment and work. For example, there was an environment problem at the basis of the pandemic, and this is reflecting on the world of work. So we need to take care of the environment so that our workers can be safe.
We can't hear Claire. Are you muted, Claire?
Sorry about that. Peter, would you like to follow up on some of the thoughts that Paolo lined out?
Yes, well, I'll just build on some examples. The whole artificial intelligence and robotics. Interestingly, in the manufacturing field, like the automotive, the robotics thing is already gone through. And now unions and management talk about cobots, things that help people instead of just replacing them. And the next stage is the AI, and now it's machine learning. But machine learning is statistical learning, and that means your powers of prediction are greatly enhanced. But that has to be matched by judgment. So what are the power? Who gets to judge? And are there forms of judgment that are important from workers and engineers and folks on the shop floor? That's one aspect of it. In the service industry, it's quite different, where I think what economists sometimes call the algorithmic revolution. It's actually the software architecture that is the driver. And if you look at an Amazon warehouse, that's what's going on. It's a software driver that's fundamentally driving people to extremes, that almost like the old Charlie Chaplin Modern Times assembly line picture comes up. And there the question is this a humane way to treat people? And to extend it, do you want a hospital to run like an Amazon warehouse? I don't think you do. So again, you start with a technology question, and you wind up with a social and an ethical issue. That's what ties it together, I think.
Right. Sarah, I was wondering if we could speak to you. I know popularly people talk about the environmental movement is dominated by young people, and I was wondering how that ties into the young workers movement, which you're so involved in.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, historically, the young Christian workers have always seen their key topic in issues related to work, but also now even our founder has said, if you only talk about work, you're are actually bound to miss one very important aspect of the young worker's life. And since we are analyzing all the aspect of life, of course, we're also talking about the gender and about the race, etc., as we also already talked about also here. And it's actually been in our last International Council, which has been 5 years ago, that young workers themselves said that the environment and the ecology is also one very important aspect to tackle. And there's actually several national movements who are having actions, especially on the aspect of ecology itself and about how to save our Mother Earth, as the Pope says. But it's actually also one very important aspect when we talk about technology, because there are so many aspects which, if we talk about technology and the digitalization, there's questions like, what about the electronic waste? And how about all this raw material which is necessary in order to produce the devices which we need? And this is actually linked also to the question about the working conditions of those who produce the electronic devices. So we do think that these are actually topics which are not really looked at if we talk about digitalization, but we do think that we need a real discussion about it.
Right. And I was also going to ask Father Kiley, your experiences in the labor movement, how are unions integrating sustainability into what they advocate for, or how they do work?
I think there's a number of things that are beginning to happen. One of the issues during this past year, as we've looked at particularly the immigrant population in our workforce, sort of the myth that was always the popular meme here in the US anyway, was people are coming for economic advantage. I think there's been much more attention in the past year that people are coming here because they're environmental refugees.
Mm.
And that we've had a period where our job market is very poor. So that would not be the allure to come to the US looking for a job. It is really fleeing economic or environmental disasters in many cases. So that has become part of the conversation in our union organizing. Again, it's something we would have talked about, wage and hour issues or workplace safety issues, and been very focused that way. But now we're talking, our members have left places because of environmental issues. And they're very conscious of, when we talk about workplace safety now, and Professor McCartan mentioned the meat packers working in an environment that was completely unsafe. And those workers were devalued. All of a sudden, in the course of this year, those same workers are being described as essential workers. So there's something a little bit schizophrenic going on in our national dialogue maybe around this. But I think all of a sudden we're in the labor movement. You're seeing questions of the dignity of work, as Peter described, is inherent in the work itself. There are people who are essential workers. Who would have said 18 months ago that a grocery clerk was an essential worker? No, here they're minimum wage workers and they're devalued. But now all of a sudden they're essential workers because they're stepping into dangerous environments to go to work. And so environment, I mean, I think there's been a major shift in the way we conceive of workplace and how these issues intersect: immigration, environment, and the value of work. The other thing, if I might just comment, Peter mentioned the robots, and you're absolutely right, Peter. They came into the automotive world, but now they're entering into the hospitality world. You go to a hotel these days, you check in at a kiosk. It's hands-free, contactless, everything's. You go to a restaurant, you have to take out your phone and, you know, draw up the menu because a waiter is not, or a server is not going to give you a menu. So there are things that are beginning to shift that way. And And also where we have different types of workers. One last example I'd give you is we have maybe several thousand Silicon Valley. They all have multiple cafeterias and Starbucks and those kinds of things. The tech workers have all been working from home. They kept the food service workers on because they could afford to do that. But are those tech workers ever going to come back to work on a campus? We don't know that yet. I think there's a lot of flex going on. And then therefore, do you need those food service workers? So there's a lot still being questioned. And the whole idea of even having conventions, which would be a major factor in a city like Chicago. And we're seeing that even the airlines are kind of focusing on resort areas, not so much on cities like maybe Chicago or Toronto to have conventions. They may go to other places. So there's a lot in flux, and when will those things come back? And corporate real estate is a big question. This thing has just cracked open so many pieces, but that's frightening at times. On the other hand, I think, as Sarah mentioned, that you all of a sudden that you could be talking about environment and the dignity of work and the inherent value within work. These conversations are on the table, and I think Joe McCartan is correct that the old neoliberal conversation kind of ran its course, and we're in a new moment. And I think there's something very exciting in it at the same time.
Right. Well, I think that sort of cracking open really gets to the point of why we're all here today. We do have a question that we're going to move on to from the audience. Piero asks for anyone who feels that they want to speak to this. My question is, as a community, as a school, businesses, how can we work together to help young people and adults discover and develop their talents and skills if we don't want 30% of the working population to become unemployable in 10 years? And I thought perhaps that could go to Joe or Paolo.
I'll start, but I'm sure others can speak to this maybe even better than me. So, I think one thing I hear sort of implied in that question is the idea that people will become unemployable, that 30% of people might become unemployable in the future. I think, in my view, that's not likely to happen. I think that there are going to be vast changes that are occurring. And Father Kiley just alluded to some of them that are hitting hospitality workers. And we're not sure how much of the old world will return once we're vaccinated and have herd immunity and move beyond COVID. We know that in some ways work will be forever changed. We also know that technology is busy changing work. It was doing that before the pandemic. It's doing it during the pandemic. The very use of this device, Zoom, is changing things radically and might have a very big effect on higher education where I work. So technology is changing things too. But I'm not so sure that the question of unemployability is the key question going forward. And what I think is so important about what Pope Francis helps us think about is the question of power. It's not so much, I think, that jobs will disappear. And Peter, alludes to the fact that we've been saying really since the 1920s, the robots are coming, and they're going to, do away with all kinds of jobs. And, they are changing jobs for sure. Some jobs are disappearing. Others are being created. I heard somebody recently talk about the job of robot wrangler, which might be happening in some workplaces before long. But I think the key question is one of how technology is redistributing power, and who has power. And right now in the United States, we're awaiting results on a very important union vote that's taken place in Alabama in a warehouse of the Amazon Corporation. The key issue there was not pay for the workers. It was the constant surveillance by technology that they were undergoing there. The first thing they have to do when they come to work at Amazon is download an app onto their smartphones. It's an app that tracks them every minute of the day when they're on the floor of the warehouse, and constantly keeps track of a thing called time off task. That is, if you go to the bathroom, if you just pause for a moment to turn to speak to somebody, the phone is calculating the amount of time you're doing that. And that became oppressive for workers to the point where even in one of the most anti-union settings in the United States, in the South, a really powerful urge emerged for a union in this plant. We don't know yet whether they will be successful, but we do know what they were mostly angry about, and that was how much technology had given their employers power over every minute of their drawing a breath during the workday. And so I think that is a key issue we need to focus on.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else want to speak to that?
Well, maybe was just a word Peter mentioned before, which is formation. At one level, I think this is important. So the way we structure the curricula and the formation system, so to provide people with the new capabilities that are needed and the ability to renew their capabilities. On the other hand, I do agree with Joe, and the question is basically a political one. There is little that we can do, each of us on our own. There is much that we can do together as citizens. And in that sense, the real important question is, what kind of world do we want to live in? The very same question that is now about work and the employability in the future could have been asked 2 centuries ago or 1 century ago about the role of women in society. And how did that change? Simply, in inverted commas, because we decided that we didn't want a world where women could not vote any longer. And there was a pressure, a political pressure for change. If we want a different world, we need a political action to make it happen. It will not happen on its own. It will not be brought about by technology or whatever, but only by human political action. And this is a very important point. And it's also very related to the story of to the history of the world of work, because all the changes that they brought about trade unions are of that kind, political decisions.
Great, thank you. We have another question from the audience, from Evangeline. She asks, actually back to you, Paulo. You mentioned that work is a relationship that needs care. How is that broader notion of work as a relationship embraced in global policy? It seems profit at times puts ecology at a disadvantage in most cases.
In most cases, but not all, and it's also a question of perspective, I would say. There is a short run or a short-sighted economics and politics that would give profit an advantage, and a long-term perspective, which is not saying the same. And in that sense, is a big source of hope, the fact that that there are more and more, I would say, caring capitalists, or for example, investors who are aware, institutional investors, who are aware that, for example, sustainable jobs or sustainable companies are a safer investment than companies that give high profits in the short run, but do not care for the environment. In the long run, the capital you invest in those type of business is more likely to get lost. So it's a question of prudence to invest in sustainable, and this is giving a different balance to between profit and ecology, I think. So that's a sign of hope, and it's an example to build upon.
Would anyone else like to comment on that relationship between ecology and profit?
Make one additional comment, which is if we look around, many corporations are now, and industries, saying they're going to get to net zero carbon by somewhere in the range of 2030 to 2050, because they know they have to respond, if only just to maintain their own legitimacy. Well, I've been, in my lifetime, mostly associated with the steel industry, probably most people's notion of the classic smokestack industry. But in fact, 70% of the steel is already recycled. It's the most recycled material of all, much better than plastics or aluminum, whatever. But the remaining problem is for every ton of iron ore to make steel, you need a ton of coal. So you have to get rid of the coal. And you can do that, particularly the Canadian industry is looking at biocarbon, which is actually biomass from the forest industry or pulp and paper. The experiments are already underway to take eliminate at least 75% of the remaining emissions problem in the next 10 or 15 years. And beyond that, you use hydrogen. So there's no emissions at all. So one, across the board, I think more and more industries and organizations see for their own legitimacy, if nothing else, because corporations functioning for profit still need social legitimacy. So net zero carbon has come up in a way in the last 18 months we never thought of. So each industry has to do it differently. So I think that is on the horizon. I think people are trying to find those new things, because as Francis says, many of the issues of the environment relate to work, either how industries are organized or how technologies are organized. And that's just one practical example.
I have another practical example, perhaps. Maybe if you've checked into a hotel in the past couple of years, you were asked, would you like to sign up for the green program? Which was that you wouldn't have your room cleaned by a housekeeper, you wouldn't change towels so many times. And what was fascinating about that was an attempt by the corporate structure to look as though it was being environmentally sensitive. The housekeepers, though, basically pointed out that what was happening to them was that they were being assigned twice the number of rooms to clean with not any increase in their salaries. And their concern about their environmental concern was the cleaning liquids that they were asked to use in the first place. Their hands were getting burned. They wondered, where does this stuff go? Does this end up in Lake Michigan? I mean, so they were raising serious environmental concerns just about that kind of thing. And so I think it's forced that question that Paulo raised, this is work as a relationship that requires care. And these housekeepers are saying, you're saying you're environmentally sensitive. That's phony. That's not genuine. Let's talk about what's happening to us in this workplace and what the environmental concerns are here. Just to carry that a little bit further, Joe McCartan mentioned that the idea of power, and that Pope Francis is talking about that, but I also want to keep it linked to this idea of care in the workplace. And through the COVID crisis, one of the things we're finding is there's a lot of interest in labor unions, at least in this country right now, because people don't feel cared for. What happened in the hotels as COVID kicked in and everything was shutting down, not only did they furlough the housekeepers, they furloughed the human resource departments. So there was no one to care for those workers, to help them navigate the social services. That's why local unions had to step in and do that, which was really a stretch, but that's what folks had to do. But as people are coming back to work now, is a question of recall. And do the companies care about getting their workers back? And in some cases, there are collective bargaining agreements to protect that, but many others are not covered by that. And it looks as though the corporate world wants to get rid of the legacy employees, the older employees, that is the more expensive employees, and start all over again. So this question of a caring workplace is an environmentally sensitive workplace. It's all coming together right now. And workers are looking for power to make sure that that is protected.
Well, that's certainly a very interesting example for this discussion. We have a question from Tracy that's sort of about the political side of things. She says, we need to recognize that literacy, education, and re-education are political choices. Historically, they have been subject to political contestation. How can civil society protect and support education when current politics do not seem to offer average people a way to participate in that sort of decision making? If no one feels sort of equipped to talk about that sort of side of things, we can move on to a different question. Nobody? Okay.
Well, I'll just say something because
Sure.
the person was, it's such a big question. I think that's why we all paused for a second. But it really goes to the heart of things. I think one of the things we're living through right now is not just, a breakdown in some of our social institutions that have protected workers in the past, but also a breakdown of faith in democracy itself. So I feel like over much of the developed world, we're seeing this right now. That democracy is under a graver threat than it has been in a very long time. And that needs to be factored in as we think about this moment. In my own view, I think one reason why democracy is under such threat is that we allowed it to atrophy so much at work. There was a time in which we understood that extending democracy into work relations was a very important way of preserving democracy. But we saw that atrophy over the past half century, and I think that's one reason why. There are complex reasons, but one reason why democracy is experiencing such a crisis broadly at this moment.
If I may add a word, going back to Pope Francis, it's not Laudato Si, it's Evangelii Gaudium, but I think here what we should reflect upon is teaching about conflict. There is what you have to struggle for what you really want. And this is going on in all social processes, and the world of work is ridden with conflict. We have to learn how to manage that if we want to arrive at the end that we want to reach our goals. And in that sense, maybe even what is going on in these months, I think of the pandemic, but also things like Black Lives Matter is a reminder there is conflict in our society, and maybe a certain percentage of the population in rich countries has somehow forgotten that you still have to struggle for what you really want. And democracy is something like that. And I agree with Joe in that.
Claire, just 2 minutes, if I may. No, just in the same line. And maybe it's even fitting to the last 3 questions, that actually we should not regard education as something totally separate from all the other discussion. But the question is, in the end, not only about how our education is supposed to be organized, but how do we want our economy and our society to be organized? And that matter is not only a question about how do we educate people and workers to be employable, because we do have the big issue of unemployment, not because we have issues in education, but because of issues of how many jobs do we have. And the question is not only how many jobs do we have, but what is the quality of job. And in that matter, I think it's really, really important to have this reflection about work must be care and care must be work, and work must be linked to relationship, because especially when we talk about the new forms of work and the forms of work driven by the technical development, like the self-employed working at Uber or in different other platforms, there's especially exactly one example of people not having any really work relationship at all anymore, and the so-called employer or the platform not really assuming their responsibility. So that's one of the matters we should talk about. And if we talk about how our society should be organized, we do see that actually there is enough work to do. The question is just who is going to pay it. No, and especially in the care sectors, there's so much work. And if we would actually talk about changing maybe power relationships and changing the question who is paying for the common good, then we would find ways to pay actually for this important work which must be done in the care sectors. Sorry.
Oh, no need to apologize. That's a great answer. I will put sort of a final question out there that I think can help us wrap up. And it's from Dr. Yetman. He says, or she says, the issue of work has been central to Catholic social teaching since Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum. To what extent do Catholic religious communities have an obligatory role in participating in this change and even somewhat crisis in work?
I think, Peter here, I think you can look at from Rerum Novarum, which was really endorsing the voice in the workplace, trade unions. Modern Catholic social thought has a very strong tradition about workers' rights, collective bargaining rights, labor standards. But we're now, and those things should apply within Catholic institutions themselves, of course. But we've now got a set of issues that broaden out beyond that. So, for instance, the question of a universal basic income, that the Pope has said, that people have a right to the basis of a decent life. But there's various competing kinds of UBIs out there, some of which would just eliminate the welfare state, and that I don't think was a good thing. But Francis goes beyond that, saying labor, he said, a society that was simply divided between people who worked and didn't work would be an unbalanced and ultimately a dangerous society to live in. So the church goes further, saying human labor work is inherently valuable for reasons of dignity, development of capacity, building the common good. So that is a common link that we had not talked about previously, and that may be a concluding comment from me.
I would just jump in also. In Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII really concluded that groundbreaking encyclical by saying, go to the worker. He meant the church, all of us, go to the worker. And he committed at the end of that encyclical that workers should be able to count on the pastoral solicitude of the church and its ministers, always. And so I think there's a pretty clear mandate there, and that's been repeated in every social encyclical since then for 120 some years. I think what Pope Francis has really added to this discussion is sort of underlining that phrase, go to the worker. He's saying, get out of the sacristies. I mean, he's talking to us clergy as well. Do we ever, for example, just gather with our parishioners as workers, not as, mass goers, or not as contributors with their envelopes, but as workers? Do we ever ask them, what happens to you when you go to work? Let's have that discussion in our parish community. I think what Pope Francis is saying is we need to go out, we need to accompany working people. and be informed. And we need to accompany them when they share with us they're in painful situations. The church's response to those situations is not sorry for your troubles. It's to be present and to accompany them. That may mean on picket lines or during strikes or other challenging moments for working people. But that's where we belong, alongside workers. And the last comment was this idea of just treatment, as Peter mentioned, for those who work for the church. I'll hold up, Georgetown has a fabulous policy, a just treatment policy for all of its employers. And I'd recommend that to any Catholic organization to have something similar.
I can jump in on that point very quickly after Father Kiley. He's right that Georgetown has a policy called the Just Employment Policy. It's easily found if you Google it. Georgetown University Just Employment Policy. And it does require that not only directly hired workers, but those hired by our contractors pay a just wage and respect workers' rights to form unions. And Father Kiley actually was instrumental in helping Georgetown's food service workers form a union a number of years ago under Aramark, the contractor that we have. And the existence of that policy was a guide to Aramark that they shouldn't fight their employees' ability to form a union. I think that the church does need to stand up for these values in its institutions, in the institutions that are linked to it. And if it's not practicing what it preaches, then its preaching loses credibility. And I'm proud that Georgetown's been fighting to try to put into effect some of these things.
All right, well, I think that's a good note to conclude on, and a good message from Father Kiley for the academics and the journalists and the clergy, everyone on this call. Go to the workers. That's sort of where you'll find these answers and find these innovations. So with that, I mean, we had so many wonderful, thoughtful questions that came to us that we weren't able to address in the time here, but I encourage everyone to sort of reach out one-to-one with more questions to continue this conversation, as I'm sure it will over the next couple of years as things begin to transform in that post-pandemic economy. And thank you again to all of our panelists for taking time on this Tuesday afternoon to dig into these issues, Tuesday morning, afternoon, depending on where you are, evening too. Yeah, and with that, that's the conclusion of today's panel. So thank you all.